Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to introduce you to a gentleman tonight that I came across because he wrote a column that I found very provocative. Steve Lafleur, he's a senior policy analyst with the Fraser Institute, and he describes himself as a public policy analyst focused on improving the quality of life in North American cities. As a suburbanite turned urbanist, he's interested in how to balance the needs of suburban areas with historic areas, historic cores, vibrancy and affordability, mobility and growth. He loves North American cities, and he believes the best days are still ahead. But he also believes that we don't have easy solutions. And he thinks that dispersed decision-making, over-centralization, and incentives matter a lot. And getting them right is essential to healthy metropolitan areas. He's got an interesting background. He's a senior policy analyst at the Fraser Institute. As I mentioned, he's been there for over 6 years. He's a freelance columnist. Before that, he was with the Frontier Center for Public Policy. He's a graduate of Wilfrid Laurier University. He's been a teacher there as well, and Laurentian University. Quite the background. And I got to tell you, the column that you wrote was about the lack of affordable housing in Canada. We're not talking about social housing. We're just talking about housing for everybody. So, Steve, tell me, what's the problem?
So one of the challenges is that Toronto and Vancouver in particular are very attractive cities to people, not only from within Canada, but from the rest of the world. And so we have a lot of people moving into both, a lot of people willing to spend a lot of money for housing. The challenge is that we just haven't really built as much as we need. So there's a mismatch between the people who want to move here and the number of houses to be purchased.
Mismatch, so it's supply and demand.
I mean, broadly, yes. Ultimately, people can talk about speculation and so forth, but the reality is that people speculate when there's a reason to speculate.
So I had, one person on my show this week that said the problem is that the government's not spending enough money on providing affordable housing. I had someone else come and say, no, the problem's all about speculators and foreign investors. And I had someone else come and say, no, the problem is municipal governments and their regulatory processes. What do you think the problem is? What's causing the situation?
Well, I think all those things are mutually exclusive. I think that housing needs to be built. Now, one could argue about what role the government should have in financing, paying for houses, et cetera. That's a separate question. And respectable people can have different opinions on that. There's a certain number of housing units that need to be built. How they get built is, it's a secondary issue. I think that municipalities certainly do have a major role in it. The one thing that I'll say is that broadly, there's kind of a discussion. Some people look at the demand side of the equation primarily and say, the issue is that there are too many people who want to invest in housing because they see it as a speculative asset that they can cash in on. And their solution tends to be, well, we need to find a way to tax or regulate these people. But then there's also the supply side of the equation, which I think is more important, the provision of housing. I think that we really get focused on the demand side stuff because it's really easy to find villains. It's really easy to say, there are investors from other parts of the world that are the problem, and we just need to crack down on them, and everything will be fixed. I mean, it's a really easy and attractive narrative. The trouble is that really it breaks down when you start to think about why people speculate. People don't speculate because housing is some intrinsically good investment. The reason they would speculate is because they believe that the prices are going to go up in the future. Now, why is the price going to go up in the future to begin with? Well, look at all the people moving into Toronto. Since 2015, Toronto and Vancouver have really taken the lead in job creation in the country. And at the same time, the number of housing units per year being built between those two metropolitan areas hasn't really changed all that much. It's just a matter of math at this point. Something needs to change in terms of the number of houses being built, or this problem is going to continue.
So let me break this down, if I could. So people think foreign speculators, foreign investors are the problem. With my experience, and you probably know the statistic, is that a lot of the people, most of the people that are coming in from wherever and investing in a condo or a house or whatnot, they're renting that out. And so, if they're buying something and renting it out, isn't that adding to the housing supply? And if there's too much of that, frankly, that'd be great, because that would mean that there'd be too much of a supply of rental housings, and the vacancy rate would go up and rental prices would go down, which we're clearly not seeing. So there's not too many people that are buying condos and renting them out, even though that would be the typical thing someone that would be an investor would do. Would they not?
Yeah, and so there's two parts to that. The first part is that there's the concern that people will just not rent them out. Vancouver had a empty housing tax that was meant to address that, and there was some analysis done by, I think it was by the city, to determine how many households or how many units that actually brought on the market. And I can't remember the exact numbers that I came up with, but it was the equivalent of something like 5 or 10 large condo buildings. Now, that's not nothing, but at the same time, there's a lot of room to build 5 or 10 condo buildings in Vancouver or Toronto. The second part is that people will argue, it's bad if these speculators are buying houses and then renting them out, because they're, profiting off of people rather than letting them, live the North American dream of owning their own house. However, first of all, not everybody wants to own their house. There's a lot of reasons not to. I don't. Part of the reason is because it gives me flexibility. That's a personal lifestyle decision that I've made. And a lot of other people will make that. So having the option to rent houses is a good thing. It's a good thing to have a lot of different options. The bigger problem is just we need more options. We need more of everything. We need more single attached houses. We need more townhouses. We need more condos. There's no reason we should look at this as a problem of inherent scarcity.
So and again, you're the smart guy, so you may know this better than I, but the statistic of home ownership between Canada and the United States, I understand, is approximately the same. And the percentage of people that own the homes. And yet in the United States, they have a huge tax incentive towards home ownership through mortgage interest deductibility, such that the interest that you pay on your mortgage is deductible against your taxes, which means that, effectively the interest that you're paying is like a third to a half less impactful than it would be in Canada. And I had one economist on my show that said, given that we have the same approximate home ownership in Canada as the United States, and we don't have that incredible economic incentive for home ownership, says that there's just this psychic reason that Canadians want to own a home, whether it's been passed down from our parents or it's just part of our society, and that it's probably too high, and that if we actually had more people that would rent, we would have more flexibility within the labor force, because one of the biggest reasons why people don't take new jobs in new cities is because of the difficulty of selling and buying homes. And if we had more flexibility, we'd have more flexible labor markets, we'd have a more productive economy, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think about that argument?
So that's certainly an interesting question. I think that it's hard to pin down a perfect number of what the home ownership rate should be. There are a lot of factors that go into that. People have different lifestyles, different preferences. People in different metropolitan areas might have different preferences. For instance, the flexibility argument might be more important if you're in a smaller center than a larger center, because if you live in Toronto, it's just such a large labor market that, maybe it doesn't impinge on your flexibility. But then again, I'm a perfect example. I've never owned a house. I never planned to own a house. And part of that is that, I've moved around so much and I understand the value of having that flexibility. So there certainly is an advantage of people being able to rent. Part of the challenge, I think, is that the options aren't necessarily there. For instance, if you want to rent an apartment style house, a lot of the units available are condo units that somebody else owns. And it's not as frictionless as, purpose-built rental building where, you deal with a property management company and, you can't get rent evicted and you can't get, asked to leave because they want to move back into their unit. So I think that really highlights the importance of having a lot of different types of options.
We're chatting tonight with Steve Lafleur. He is a public policy analyst at the Fraser Institute. He has been commenting on the housing crisis, effectively the lack of a reasonable, affordable housing lifestyle in Canada. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Steve in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about housing and the lack of reasonably priced, I won't call it affordable, but reasonably priced housing. Some people would call it a housing crisis in Canada, particularly. I think it's major urban areas, major metropolitan areas, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, across Canada. We're chatting with Steve Lafleur. He's a senior policy analyst at the Fraser Institute, and he's recently penned a column that I read that was about this issue. Steve, my reading of your column was that you thought the biggest issue was municipal governments and their regulatory processes that took too long, that cost too much money, and that didn't give you the density and the zoning that you need. Is that your point, or am I missing it?
That is precisely it. The challenge is that there's no inherent limit on the number of housing units we can have in the GTA. Theoretically, the entire GTA could look like downtown Toronto. I mean, maybe there's some ecological limits, but for the sake of argument, you can put a lot more housing units. And then you have to ask yourself, if housing is that expensive and lucrative, why aren't people building more? And the answer is that there's just a lot of restrictions on it. For most of the GTA, for most of the greater Vancouver area, you just can't build anything other than a single detached house. And there's only so many that you can build. So while you need...
Why is that? Because
houses,
of zoning?
Yeah, because they're zoned out.
So I had Jennifer Keesmaat, the former chief city planner in Toronto, on my show. And she said one of the biggest mistakes we made is that when we did the Yonge Street subway, we increased the zoning, particularly at transit nodes like Yonge and Bloor, Yonge and Eglinton, Yonge and Shepherd, et cetera, to allow for density. But when we built the Bloor Danforth line and the University line, we did not do the same thing. And so therefore we never got the density that we need and that would house the people along our major transit nodes. And she went further and said, and we should be doing the same thing along GO train lines, particularly if John Tory and any kind of RER, Regional Express Rail or Smart Tracks or anything like that occurs. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, part of the business case for these types of projects in the first place is the idea that you're going to get more of that transit-oriented development, so that the closer people are, the greater number of people close to a transit stop, the more it will be used. There's quite the decay the further you get people out. So the more people within 400 or so meters, the more people are going to ride. And so in order to get people that close, you essentially need to stack units on top of each other. And you mentioned Yonge and St. Clair, where I am right now. The whole neighborhood, because it's zoned for dense development, is quite dense. But if you look at, there are transit stops for the SkyTrain, subway in Toronto, where there really isn't the kind of density there needs to be. So yes, I would agree that it has been a mistake to not aggressively upzone along transit lines.
And then I had Joe Barrage from Urban Strategies on my show, and he said, but people that worry that this is going to happen, and you said it, all across Toronto, he says it's not going to happen across Toronto. It's only going to happen at the transit nodes. And he used Yonge Street as an example, and he flashed up a picture of Toronto, and he proved that you get this huge density right at Yonge and Eglinton, Yonge and Shepherd, et cetera. But like a block away, you're back to single family homes. And so therefore, you're 400 meters. I think that the way that the City of Toronto transit node definition is written is 800 meters. And he said that's stupid because it actually doesn't go that far. It's about 400 meters. So it only impacts what's right there at the transit node, but not half a block or a block away. A block away, you're still going to have single family homes. And so therefore, the NIMBY type people that want to object to it shouldn't be objecting to it. What do you think about that argument?
So just as an anecdote, one of my close friends grew up right next to a transit station, probably 4,800 meters away, and that house is still there. It's still a single detached house, and there's no reason why, if you allowed, it wouldn't be at least turned into something like a 4-story walk-up, because who wouldn't want to live next to, or rather, I'm sure there are a lot of people who wouldn't want to, but there are a lot of people who would want to live in, a townhouse or a 3-story walk-up if it was available. It's purely a regulatory issue.
So then I had another gentleman who wrote a book called The Missing Middle on, and he said that the problem is that we only build, and you said it, single family homes, or he said condos. And he said that, what we're doing is building 10 units per acre, which would be the typical single family home. And he said that frankly, it's, like 4 to 6 units per acre typically, or 100 or 200 units per acre in a condo. And he said, but when people are asked in poll after poll what they want to live in, is what they actually say is pre-war communities like Blue West Village, like Yorkville, like the Beaches, like Port Credit, et cetera, that are, he said, 20 to 40 to maybe 60 units per acre. And he said that that's what is sort of the middle, and it's the missing middle. And it's almost impossible to zone like that because it's not just single family homes. It may be single family homes with really small lots, or it's duplex, or it's 4 homes together, but not a big, huge townhouse complex, or it's laneway homes, or it's homes that have got a carriage house turned into a home behind it or something like that. So he thought that the regulatory process that was, he would argue, too prone to 10 units per acre or 100 or less, and 100 units per acre or more was the mistake. What do you think of that?
So I certainly agree that the missing middle is a big issue. Ultimately, I think we need more choices. We need kind of an all of the above approach. And, part of the challenge is that I think that there is a bit of a false dichotomy where people think, if we upzone, it means there's going to be a 50-story building like mine next to it. And that's not always the case. You think about cities like Paris. Paris isn't known for, having gigantic seas of skyscrapers, but it's a very dense city. The annex in Toronto is quite dense, and it's, mostly kind of ground level housing. There are a lot of ways to do these things, but when you set all kinds of different requirements, like minimum parking requirements, for instance, that, add tens of thousands of dollars per unit, you just get different types of housing than you would. And certainly it's kind of ironic. A lot of the most desirable communities in both Canada and the rest of the world are, as you pointed out, kind of older neighborhoods that were developed before the automobile. And they're not really legal to build today because, the lot sizes are too small, or there's inadequate parking, or the building codes have changed and they're just grandfathered in. Try building the annex today. That would be challenging. So I think that we really need to have a more flexible approach, because a lot of these regulations aren't really aimed at maintaining the quality of life. They're just aimed at that. They essentially maintain old planning ideas that have ossified and really haven't helped us in any way.
Maintaining old planning ideas. That's fascinating. So I had another guy come in and tell me that these parking regulations were absurd because this is planning for a world of 1980 or 1990, not a world of 2030 or 2040 with electronic vehicles or autonomous vehicles, where we would not need nearly as much parking. And that what we should be doing is dramatically reducing our parking requirements, which would allow us to build a lot more affordable housing, market affordability housing, and what we're going to be left with in 5-10 years with electronic vehicles or autonomous vehicles is a whole bunch of useless parking spots. What do you think of that?
Yeah, and I think the challenge is that with both road usage and parking specifically, while there are ways to price them, we tend not to. And so part of the challenge is because we don't have a mechanism to allocate them efficiently, people are worried about building units that don't have parking because they think, well, those people might use the parking space that I'm entitled to, which first of all can be mitigated by more efficient parking permitting practices. That's pretty white bread, easy to do stuff. The other part is that a lot of people like myself just don't end up using those parking spaces to begin with. So you pay the cost of it, but then you also don't use it. So it's just a dead weight loss to society.
So is that fair to a guy like you that you have to pay for a parking spot you don't use?
Well, I certainly don't think so.
Makes it less affordable, right?
Sure. If you have to pay the cost of an underground parking stall in downtown Toronto, I don't recall the exact numbers. There was a recent report that estimated it, but we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. It's not cheap.
So we've got parking issues. We've got missing middle issues. We've got not upzoning around transit node issues. Then I had a planner come on and say, the issue is municipalities that don't have zoning anywhere close to either their official plan or the places to grow legislation. And that they're just like 5 years behind, if not more, in matching the kind of zoning that really is required by their official plan and or current legislation.
Yeah, so that's a major challenge. The trouble is that if you want to have restrictions on urban sprawl and you want to have reasonably affordable housing, you can do that. But what you need to do is you need to be pretty permissive about allowing intensification in areas where it's allowed. And if cities aren't really living up to that, that's a problem. And there are a lot of ways they cannot live up to it. I mean, the problem is a lot of it's done on a project by project basis. You know, community opposition can easily make city councilors oppose projects that make a lot of sense for the whole city, but that might, you know, have some disadvantages, some small disadvantages for the local area. So a lot of it isn't even just the way things are zoned, it's the way that community opposition can be translated into the political process. You know, the part of the trouble is that the cards are stacked against development because people who don't currently live in a neighborhood or a city don't have a say. You know, the people who already live there, who, you know, own a house, they vote, they, you know, can contact their city councilor, etc. But somebody from Manitoba who might theoretically want to live in Toronto has no say.
Or someone
So,
from India or China that wants
or
to.
somebody, yeah.
So I had Joe Barrage, Urban Strategies, on, and he agreed with you. And it was interesting. He said governance is our issue, and he said that he could prove that cities that elect their councilors or their representatives on a citywide basis make far better decisions on development than councilors that are elected from a specific area, because they're no longer dependent on the votes of those local residents that tend to be NIMBYism in regards to against development in their area. But if they're elected citywide, like a mayor is, that they'll then make the right decisions for the whole city.
Yeah, that is the challenge. By slicing it up into a ward system instead of an at-large system, you're basically giving veto power to a small number of local people because they're heavily engaged, they have a touch point who has a strong incentive to agree with them, as opposed to make decisions that, you know, are beyond just the ward boundaries. And so when you have every city councilor with those same incentives, that makes it really hard to decide where development is going to happen, because everybody's got a strong incentive to say, not in my backyard, not in my community, put it in their community.
And then I had someone else come on and say, this is going to only get worse with this new thing about inclusionary zoning. And so maybe you can explain it to us, but I understand inclusionary zoning is going to mandate developers to include a certain percentage of affordable housing. But what that's going to do is that is going to mean that they're going to have to raise the prices on everything else to pay for that affordable housing. And so therefore, by creating this affordable housing, the problems have been created by everything we've talked about, and putting it on the new housing is going to become even more expensive. And so therefore, even less affordable.
Yeah. So one of the challenges is that if you want the government to have a certain mechanism to ensure that low-income people can have housing, you can do it in a lot of ways. You can do it, you know, through broad transfers like Section 8 housing in the United States, where they have housing vouchers. You can do it through building public housing, et cetera. There are a lot of ways to do it. I'm not going to debate the wisdom of, you know, one or the other approach, or to what extent it needs to be done. But I think with inclusionary zoning, it's particularly problematic because effectively it's a tax on people moving into new buildings. So you're putting the entire burden of the subsidy on people who are buying into the project, which really seems unfair when you consider that, you know, you go down the street and there's, you know, longtime residents there who don't pay anything for it. So, you know, you have to ask yourself, why are we saying that we're going to charge, you know, the 100 people who move in this building to subsidize 20 people?
Yeah. So what's the solution?
Well, I mean, I think that we need to think more broadly about housing, and instead of tinkering around the margins. I think we really need to be more permissive. The city of Toronto is talking about either getting rid of or modifying parking minimums. I think that's a good starting point. I went to one of the consultations, and I thought that the ideas were pretty good. I also got the sense that it might be a little bit challenging for them to actually get it through. I hope they can. But I think that a big part of the problem is we really need to be clear-eyed about this and realize there's not going to be a reason why people are going to stop moving to Toronto anytime soon. Something catastrophic would have to happen for this to be the case. And, obviously that's not a good scenario either, but so we need to figure out how we're going to actually accommodate that without things getting too far out of control. We kind of tolerated the idea of less than 1% vacancy rates in Toronto and Vancouver for quite a long time. And the trouble is that when things are really that tight, it doesn't leave a lot of room for error. And it's really easy to get behind. And once you get behind, catching up is really hard too. So I think we really need to take a hard look and say, what can we do to ensure that we can meet all the housing needs for the region and the city? And some of that is going to be making compromises. A lot of people, understandably, they've lived in the same community for a very long time and they don't want it to change at all. But the reality is that cities do change. Yes, we've decided to impose pretty rigid zoning laws that make it difficult to do, and maybe some people have banked on that. But the reality is that part of the trade-off is that a lot of people made a lot of money by owning those tracts of land, and if the trade-off from being in that tract of land is that things are going to change around you, but you're making more money, I mean, it's hard to get too upset about that, I think.
We're chatting tonight with Steve Lafleur at Fraser Institute about whether housing is affordable in major metropolitan areas in Canada today. He's written a column recently about it and some of the challenges. It's a fascinating conversation. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more in a second. Just wait with us, please. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with a pretty smart guy, Steve Lafleur. He's a senior policy analyst with the Fraser Institute. Steve, what's the Fraser Institute?
So we're a nonprofit think tank. We do research on issues across Canada, mostly to do with public spending and taxes and regulation and so forth. And my area of interest is on the municipal side.
How did you get interested in the municipal side?
Well, so I grew up in the suburbs. So the way that I was raised was, to get in the car and go to the shopping center, and then come back home, and that's where you spend your time. But when I became an adult and moved to Toronto, and realized that it's a very different lifestyle, and that a lot of the challenges are very different. And a lot of the, you think about housing, for instance, the cost of housing and the ability to find housing is often quite a bit different, especially in Toronto and Vancouver. I've lived in both, and, I've seen firsthand how challenging the housing markets are, especially in Vancouver at certain times. And so, coming up with solutions to those things is, I think, a very important issue in Canada, and really it's come to the forefront a lot during the pandemic. But these are not new problems by any stretch. Sub 1% vacancy rates, rental vacancy rates are nothing new in Toronto and Vancouver. Extremely high home prices are, nothing new in either. And the challenge is that we don't have a lot of margin for error. There's not a lot of slack in the system. So, for instance, in the early days of the pandemic, when people started to kind of shuffle around a little bit, a lot of people started to crowd into other parts of the GTA that they wouldn't have normally moved into, and then all of a sudden, that just overwhelmed a lot of the demand for a lot of these places because they just didn't have the excess capacity to integrate them. So I think that we really need to be cautious about running our housing market, so running our system without a lot of slack in it going forward, because these kind of shocks happen. more people move than you expect. People move to different places than you expect. And if there isn't a lot of slack, then that creates a lot of problems. Anything from, it's not even just about housing affordability. It's also about having a good match between where people live and where they work and where they spend their time. And it's just hard to do that when you've got a very expensive and tight housing market. If you're living in, say, the eastern side of Toronto, for instance, and you get a job in Mississauga, if there aren't a lot of affordable and available options, then maybe you're commuting from, East Toronto to Mississauga. So it's really important that
That would be like a 2-hour commute.
well, sure. And, in the GTA, as that's not that out of the ordinary. And it's a problem, and it's a problem that we accepted it as normal for so long. And
Okay, but
hopefully,
Steve, it's only going to get worse, is it not? Joe Barrett said that, when I quoted that supposedly a population the size of the city of Montreal was coming here in the next 10 years, he said, Brian, no, in the next 30 to 50 years, we're going to double in size. He said that we are currently the third largest metropolitan area in North America. We've eclipsed Chicago, an area in size, if you define it from Kitchener to Oshawa and down to sort of St. Catharines area, the greater Toronto, Hamilton area. And he said, think about it. New York's the biggest, LA is the second, we're the third. And we're growing, and we're going to double in size because that many people are coming here, that we've got a substantial deficit of housing units already that got worse in COVID-19 because of challenges with construction, and is going to get even more worse because of immigration coming into Canada and people in Canada moving to Toronto. What are we going to do?
well, so I guess there's two things. On the one hand, it's certainly likely that things will stay the way they are. Unfortunately, big political changes that inconvenience people personally are hard to do. Those are hard conversations to do, especially with, as we discussed before, the political system that allows people to, easily veto housing in their neighborhoods. But it doesn't have to be this way. And remember, there's a lot of ways we can slice this problem. For instance, getting back to the missing middle issue, if you were to replace a neighborhood of single detached houses with a series of townhouses, you've basically doubled the density. Right. And that doesn't look as intimidating as having, a 50-story condo tower, next to your single detached house, et cetera. So there are a lot of ways in which we can adapt. The problem is we need to pick some. And at the moment, we've kind of got this double squeeze going on where we've prohibited most urban sprawl throughout the GTA, but also we've decided that we're not going to do that much to accommodate more density. So we really need to be serious about this. We need to take it seriously. The trouble is a lot of people pay lip service to it, but we don't really take it as seriously as we need to just yet politically. It is a crisis, and it's not going to just magically get better. People aren't just going to stop coming to Toronto because the prices are high. The reality is there's a whole big world out there with a lot of people who would love to be in Toronto because it's a great city and a great country.
I had another planner on that said the problem was that our zoning rules that separate industrial from residential are from a bygone era when industrial was dirty and you needed to separate it out for health reasons, and that you don't need to do that today, and that there's large swaths of Etobicoke and North York, et cetera, that are zoned industrial that frankly you could convert to residential and it wouldn't impact the number of jobs in Toronto at all. It may in fact benefit downtown Toronto and the airport corporate sector because those industrial areas would get bought up and converted into residential condos. What do you think of that? That we no longer need zoning separations between areas that are zoned industrial versus areas that are zoned residential or mixed use?
Well, certainly, as you pointed out, the context has changed. Euclidean zoning comes from Ohio and largely was based on that issue. And the same kind of approach has taken foot in Canada as well. And it made sense when, you don't want to put like a giant manufacturing plant next to, a single detached housing complex or neighborhood. At that point, it's a real livability issue if people, can't breathe because of what's next door to them. But yes, we've taken it way too far. And if you look at a lot of the kind of trendy neighborhoods in a lot of North American cities, they're precisely the ones where we've been able to carve out new
Lofts,
housing. Pardon?
lofts and old businesses,
Yeah,
lofts and old
exactly.
warehouses.
So these are and part of the advantage of these types of neighborhoods as well is that there's just not the same community opposition because there aren't as many people who live there. In my old neighborhood in Calgary, East Village, it was kind of, a rundown neighborhood for a long time. They literally built City Hall to face the other direction because they didn't want to look at the social problems. And now it's a community they aim to have something like 12,000 residents within a short period of time. So there are ways to do this, but yes, these prohibitions really become a problem. It's not one regulation; it's just layer after layer of different regulations that really just rule out most of the possibility for anything but a single detached house.
So Oxford Properties comes along with this issue that you described about NIMBYism and says we can actually build housing faster, cheaper, better on parking lots of old shopping centers than anywhere else, not because of anything else other than we don't have residents that are going to complain because it's a parking lot today.
Yeah, and some people might not like losing parking. Obviously, if your primary method of getting around is driving, it's never fun to have to look for pricing or parking or have to pay extra for it. But people need to live somewhere, and parking lots, undeveloped parcels like parking lots are low hanging fruit. I mean, this is why a lot of these big developers, that have primarily commercial real estate are putting up condo towers because it's land right there that's very usable and very high amenity. So we should embrace that. Unfortunately, well, there are a lot of examples where we haven't really embraced it with open arms. I was going to look over and say that I could see one right now, but I forgot that I'm not at home right now, so I can't.
Steve, some people say Houston's got the solution because it's got minimal rules, and they've got no housing problem because they just build what people want, and it's the market that decides rather than government decides. And then lots of people think Jane Jacobs is sort of the disciple, the person that knows the most about this, and she was always arguing, sort of like you said about the most desirable neighborhoods. She said that it's organic neighborhoods that are developing because of people rather than government regulation that are the places people want to stay in. Is government the solution or the problem here?
Well, I think the problem. I think that there's obviously a place for government in terms of financing infrastructure and having some sensible regulations about what can be built. The trouble is that we've gone so far in the other direction that the default is that you can't build without seeking permission. I'll bite just because I find this fascinating. Houston is an interesting example that people point to and say that's what cities would look like without zoning, i.e., seas of single detached houses with a small downtown or several small cores, which is not really true because Houston is nearly as regulated as anywhere else. They just do it by different means. They've got minimum lot sizes that are gigantic outside of a couple of small areas. They've got parking requirements. They've got neighborhood. What's the term? The term escapes me right now. But they've got neighborhood associations that can stop development. But they don't have like aggressive growth management. So they don't have like a green belt, for instance. So that means that there's just a lot of land to put down these giant houses on. And the other thing is that there are parts of the downtown core that they have largely deregulated. So you see these, there's actually a whole genre of internet meme about this, where you see these Houston houses that would not get built anywhere else. I'd encourage you to Google, if you want to see some interesting examples. Because Houston is very unique in that. But I think it's interesting, it shows that we kind of lack imagination about what housing should look like.
But if people want to buy it, if people want to build it and buy it, why shouldn't they have the right to do it? Why does some planner have a better judgment than the market as to what a house should look like?
Well, that's my view. I think that, especially the contradiction, the overwhelming contradiction that the most desirable neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that people will pay the most amount of money to live in right now, are not the kind of neighborhoods that we're allowing to be built. It really says something. If if we were to start from scratch right now under the rules we have, we wouldn't have cabbage towns, and people love cabbage town. People love the annex.
Wouldn't have Loris Village. Wouldn't have the beaches.
Exactly.
So I had an interesting chat with the former mayor of Mississauga, Hazen McCallion, who told me that the success of the growing residential neighborhood around Square One was because there was no limit on height, that developers could build whatever the market demanded.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that it happens all the time in Toronto and Vancouver, where there's a proposal for a tower that might be 40 stories, and then all of a sudden community opposition brings it down to 25 stories, and all of a sudden you think about it, yeah, a floor here and there doesn't really change much in the city, but then when you do it on every project and you're thinking 10 floors here, 10 floors there, well, now you talk about hundreds and thousands of units that just don't exist, and the rationales aren't great. Toronto has the infrastructure to handle a lot more people than it does. And, having more units also means more tax revenue, which allows you to pay for more amenities. So I think a lot of it is really gut level politics as opposed to any kind of rational decision making.
Gut level politics, not rational decision making. That's pretty negative. We're chatting today with Steve Lafleur. He's an analyst, public policy analyst at the Fraser Institute about housing. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio, while we're on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Steve Lafleur. He's an analyst, a public policy analyst at the Fraser Institute. Steve, we've talked about affordable housing, or just not affordable housing, but affordability of housing in Canada today for everybody, and we've identified a whole bunch of problems, whether they be inclusionary zoning or a lack of upzoning, I think you called it, around transit nodes and along transit lines, NIMBYism, regulation that doesn't allow us to build the communities that we'd like to live in, whether it be Cabbage Town or Loris Village or the beaches or Port Credit or whatnot. You say that you love North American cities and that you believe their best days are ahead, even given all these things that we've talked about. And then you say that while I'd like to see bold political leadership to push for public policy in metropolitan areas, you don't believe sitting back and waiting for white knights is the way to go. You believe that change comes from outside the political system, and it starts with ideas. Promoting good ideas as your business and your passion. Tell me, why do you believe that our better days are ahead, given all the problems we've talked about? And if you're not willing to jump into politics and be a white knight, how are you going to have positive impact?
I think a lot of this really comes down to culture and to expectations. The trouble is that we haven't really grappled with the idea that Toronto is a very large city and it's going to be an even larger city. And that means that some things are going to have to change. And that isn't going to come from, some politician coming in and deciding that things are going to be different. That has to come from, a lot of people realizing that we need to adapt. I'm optimistic about that because I think that increasingly there are a lot of people who understand the issues. Let's say short term, there will be a lot of challenges, but I do think though that we're starting to understand some of these issues and to recognize that, Toronto is not going to be, Toronto in 2050 is not going to be Toronto in 1950. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. We really just need to, I think, have different expectations about what housing entails. Obviously, a lot of people want to have backyards, and there's nothing wrong with that. We can have a lot more backyards if we have a lot more townhouses, and we can have a lot more kind of, small neighborhoods with livable green space if we have a lot more 3-story walk-ups and et cetera. So we really need to grapple with this, and we need to recognize that Toronto is going to change, and it should be for the better. And I think that there is a lot of recognition of this now, but it takes time, unfortunately.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us some of your ideas. If people want to follow you, if they want to read your article, if they want to follow some of the Fraser Institute things that you write, what's the best way for them to check out Steve Lafleur?
Well, I'm on Twitter, but obviously you can find me on the Fraser Institute website as well.
Okay. And other than housing, what else are you passionate about?
I'm really interested in ensuring that our public finances are sound. There are a lot of debates that people could have about the role of government and how large it should be, how small, et cetera. What I really worry about is that often our stated goals aren't necessarily met, and we put off big problems. Obviously, during the pandemic, finances in government have gone out the window for some understandable reasons. Obviously, hopefully once in a generation crisis is going to cause some unique problems. But having said that, I think that regardless of how you want to approach grappling with these problems, I think that we need to credibly address these problems rather than letting them fester. And it's very easy for politicians to kind of drift along and let them fester. And we kind of got mugged by reality when the pandemic came along. So I really hope that we going forward our politicians can be more prudent about their budgeting going forward.
Steve Lafleur, analyst, public policy analyst at the Fraser Institute. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. Let me give you my 2 cents, everyone. I think that Steve's got a lot of truth in what he says. I think that government, particularly municipal government, is the problem with the lack of housing in our major metropolitan areas. I don't think we've grappled with it. I don't think we have made the right decisions. I think that Joe Berridge, who said that our ward councillor system really is a weakness because it means the councillors are too influenced by the NIMBYs that are in their area and not making decisions that are for the good of for all of the city. And as Steve has pointed out, for the people that are coming to the city, which are the taxpayers of the future, the residents of the future. And so I think we've got to think through what the solutions are. And I think the solutions are that we've got to relax our zoning. We've got to speed up our zoning approvals, our building permit approvals. We got to make it less of a problem. I used to be in the pharmaceutical business, and people bemoaned how long it took to get a pharmaceutical product approved. It takes just as long, if not longer, to get a condo building approved. And you know what? I got to believe that there's a lot less scientific analysis that's got to go into a condo than into a pharmaceutical product. And if anything, what this last year and Project Warp Speed in the United States have proven is that if we want to apply our regulatory analysis, study, and approval in a far faster way because it's the right thing to do and we need it, we can do it. And I think housing is one of those things that we need to apply that to, because it is going to become completely unaffordable for my kids to live in the Greater Toronto Area if we don't tackle this problem. And you all know it, because housing prices have escalated beyond belief. And that's not good for those of us that have got a house and are going to sell, but it's a travesty for those that are our kids that need to be thinking about buying a house and are just going to give up, or they're going to move to past Georgetown when they want to buy that home. So it's relaxation of zoning regulations. It's speeding up the approval process. It's increasing density along transit nodes, transit lines. It's improving transit. It's addressing this missing middle issue. It's doing what Hazel McCallion did, which is relaxing height rules in a lot of areas. And I think if we did all that, we'd find that it would impact major arterial roads, particularly, going back to my Yonge Street example, major arterial roads at the transit nodes. But if you think about Yonge Street, a block or 2 blocks north or south of those major transit nodes, it's back to single family homes or single family commercial establishments. And so I don't think it's going to impact everything. It's going to only impact it where it can be impacted and where the market demands. I had one developer come on that told me that every condo in Toronto that had been built in the last 5 years had been built within 800 to 1,000 meters of a transit station or a transit node, which means that people will build condos where they should be built, close to where they can take transit. So I think the solutions are known. We know how to do it. Steve has written about it. We just have to implement it. And so, yeah, maybe we need bold political leadership that Steve doesn't believe exists, or maybe what we need is a whole bunch of smart people like Steve to get the message out. Thanks for joining us tonight. Good night, everybody.